Is miscarriage abortion? An Ohio woman is in a grand jury case, and her miscarriage is at the center of it. Is she or is she not facing criminal charges for miscarriage? How should a foreign saint think through the issue as a person committed to the spiritual and social vision of Jesus Christ? I'm Karai, and you're listening to the Foreign Saints podcast, a pulse check for those of us that die daily. And boy, do we have an episode in today. All right. As I just asked, is miscarriage abortion? That's the question that we're going to be thinking about, along with a bunch of other questions, along with the disputable topic of abortion itself. But what got me thinking down this road today, what really made this an episode, was the case of Ohio woman Brittany Watts, as she stands accused for something. We'll get into it. As she stands facing potential criminal charges during the time of research, right? And the conversation around her case has spiraled off into madness. You've got people on the left saying that, this woman is being criminally charged for having a miscarriage. And other people are saying, no, that's not happening. And then, of course, the conversation of abortion gets dragged in here, as it was always destined to with a topic like this. And it can create a whole, smoke screen and a fog bank. That makes it really difficult for people to talk to each other instead of talk past each other. And a bunch of emotions get dragged in, right? I think that the wisdom of God can help us. And I think that this is a good case study for showing how practical the wisdom of God actually is for the Christian attempting to engage culture, right? And when I say engage culture, I just mean engaging the people around you with the truth of the gospel and its implications, right? So I've got 3 verses out of Proverbs for us. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. And then 4 verses later, in verse 17, you get the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. And then Proverbs 19, verse 2, desire without knowledge is not good, and whoever makes haste with his feet misses his way. Misses his way, right? So what do we gather from these 3 pieces of wisdom from the Proverbs? I would say that the foreign saint, the Christian, will go against the culture by refusing to give an answer or make a hasty, active choice before hearing the matter stated by all sides and examining the situation by seeking knowledge, the facts. All right, as I have stated many times in the Bible study that I lead at home, if we claim to worship a God named truth, and we do in Jesus Christ, then we have to care about being accurate in what we present, as accurate as we're able to be, and not speaking beyond what our actual knowledge is, and being committed to having solid research habits when we actually go about researching topics, right? And so to that end, I asked the question, what are the facts? And I did my research. Now, the way that I get my news is a bit different than the way that perhaps many people get their news. And keep in mind, I'm not sponsoring this group, but I'm not being sponsored by them. But I will disclose, my news source. Right? It's an algorithm called Ground News. You can get a subscription for like $30 a year or so. And this Ground News, it doesn't, they don't write any of their own articles. They're a news source aggregation AI, right? So instead of just subscribing to Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or what have you, and just reading 1 or 2 articles about it, I've got a subscription to Ground News, and I kid you not, on this topic about Brittany Watts, a 33-year-old female, on this topic, right, I was able to scour up to 60 different articles from all over the place, right? I could see how many of them were written by left wing, right wing, and center leaning sources. I was able to see which of the news organizations had high factuality practices in their reporting versus mid and low level factuality reporting habits. And the AI is even able to analyze and give you trends in reporting styles between left wing, right wing, and center sources. Maybe another episode for another topic will, those things will be useful to us. But for today, I just want to give you the facts. All right. Because something I noticed when I was scouring through, news stories and news reports and different news sources for this topic is you would have facts mixed in with like opinions and thoughts, right? Which is interesting because I mean, from my limited understanding of news sources, I feel like that's what that's what the op-ed pieces are for. That's what the opinion columns are for, is for writers and journalists to state their opinions about cases instead of trying to, mixing that in with the actual reporting. So, to the best of my ability, these are the facts without opinion on this, on Brittany Watts' case. And again, I bring this up because I want to get to the truth of the matter so that when I or you have this conversation with people in the world, we can be truthful about it. We can correct misinformation and lies that the culture spreads, right? Like I said, chief among them being, was this woman being charged for having a miscarriage, or is that just a conveniently worded headline to try to get clicks, to try to engender sympathy for the pro-abortion cause, right? Questions to be answered after we get the facts. But for now, what are the facts? Well, just reading them out from my little notepad here. Brittany Watts, 33-year-old female medical receptionist, woke on September 22nd at her house to abdominal pain and pressure. She tried to alleviate this pain via walking. It didn't work. At approximately 5:48 in the morning, Watts delivered an approximately 15-ounce fetus into the toilet, 21 to 22 weeks along. That will be important. Hang on to that. Watts then collected the fetal remains in a bucket and placed it outdoors by the garage, then cleaned the bathroom and showered. She then went to her hair appointment, but the hairdresser noted that Watts was pale, and she called her mother to take her to the hospital. All right, now why did Watts go to the hairdresser? Well, according to her, she wanted to keep her mom unaware for a time because her mom didn't know that she was pregnant, which means she definitely didn't know that she'd miscarried. So she was trying to keep up appearances. And again, trying to keep this, what I'm about to say right now is an opinion, but as a man who has, as a married man that's gone through a miscarriage ourselves, I don't think it's the craziest opinion to say that she was probably also processing the emotions and the trauma of what all went down that morning, right? But this trip to the hospital that her mom took her to after the hairdresser appointment marked trip number 4 for pregnancy-related issues within the week. During the 3 earlier visits that week, she had been diagnosed, or well, I suppose the fetus, you could say, was diagnosed with a condition called oligohydramnios. Oligohydramnios, right? And this is a disorder of amniotic fluid resulting in decreased amniotic fluid for gestational age, right? And my source for this definition of oligohydramnios comes from the National Center for Biotechnology Information, the National Library of Medicine. And I obtained some other factoids concerning oligohydramnios that I do believe are relevant facts to this conversation. Oligohydramnios, like I said, a disorder of amniotic fluid resulting in decreased amniotic fluid for gestational age, usually as a result of a perforation of the amniotic sac causing leakage. This is a condition that complicates 4.4% of pregnancies that make it to term. Again, this is data from the National Center for Biotechnology Information, the National Library of Medicine. That is where this information is coming from. You want to dispute it, go look it up there, right? Again, I get it. I'm a Christian. I'm against abortion. I'm not going to say pro-life, but we'll get into that in the back half of this episode. But yeah, this is a condition that complicates 4.4% of pregnancies that make it to term. Of preterm pregnancies, however, this is a condition that affects less than 1% of preterm pregnancies. All right. So just getting some facts out on the table. I think any reasonable person looking at this data should be able to conclude that we are dealing with a situation that is not the norm, however you slice it, right? Less than 1%, all right? Brittany Watts' situation is in a less than 1% category, right? Because again, right, this is a 21 to 22 week old miscarriage, all right? So this pregnancy did not make it to term. That puts her situation in the less than 1% category. So we are dealing with a statistical minority, right? Now, does the fact that her situation is a statistical minority, does that mean that her situation is not as valuable as the majority? Does it mean that her situation is worthy to be discarded and not considered? No, that's not what that means, right? You've got an image bearer of God. I would say two image bearers of God involved in this scenario. This is, they're people. You can't dismiss the 1%ers just because they are the 1%ers, right? Where people go wrong, I think, is when people want to make when people want to draw rules, draw conclusions from the 4.4%, from the 1%, and then apply those observations to the majority, right? Well, because the situations are different, they're not going to apply. However, you do need to know how to, you gotta know how to handle these rare situations as they come. It just doesn't make sense to take the 1% and apply it to everything else. And of course, that even assumes that the 1% condones. Let's just be frank about it, right? It just assumes that the situation with Brittany Watts here, this 1% medical category, even justifies abortion, right? But again, we'll get into that. We keep going with the facts, right? And because, again, I'm a respiratory therapist, I've got the degree hanging on my wall, and I have had 3 to 4 years experience as an EMT in emergency medicine while in school for respiratory therapy, right? I have seen some nonsense. I've seen some nonsense in my day. So just medically, I was interested, so I kept digging, right? And the mortality rate of oligohydramnios in the second trimester, and I get it, that's very specific, but I like to be specific, right? So for oligohydramnios cases in the second trimester, which is where she would have been, right, 21 to 22 weeks, is 90%. 90%. All right, that's huge. And amongst 87% of those cases, pulmonary hypoplasia is your primary actor in the cause of death here, or one of the reasons, one of the stipulating conditions for determining for or against viability. So I went back to my own respiratory textbook, Neonatal and Pediatric Respiratory Care, a Patient Case Method by Julianne S. Peretta. And I found the definition for pulmonary hypoplasia, right? From my own textbook, pulmonary hypoplasia is defined as congenital underdevelopment of lung tissue during fetal growth. And as a respiratory therapist, I can opine a little bit I can opine with some authority on the pulmonary development of the fetus at this time, assuming all things were going normally, right? Brittany Watts was between 21 and 22 weeks when the miscarriage occurred, right? Now, for lung development, 21 to 22 weeks is during what's known as the canalicular phase of lung growth. And this phase is typically between 17 and 26 weeks gestation. The end of this stage, the 26th to 27th week, is the start of viability in most cases. Some of the reasons for that are because before this, the alveoli, right? That grapevine like cluster of pockets at the end of fully mature lungs are not fully developed. They are what's known as acinar units. And they're unusable, right? They're not able to do the work of pulling oxygen out of the air and oxygenating blood. They're not there yet. They're not done yet. Type 1 and type 2 cells are still building, right? Without type 1 cells, you don't really have the infrastructure for the lungs. And without type 2 cells, you don't have what's known as surfactant being produced. And without surfactant, surfactant is it's a substance that reduces the surface tension within the alveoli. If you don't have that, then the alveoli cannot overcome their own resistance force, and they collapse on themselves. They're unable to open. So without type 2 cells, even if the alveoli were fully formed, they wouldn't be able to stay open, therefore no oxygenation, therefore no breathing. All of this means that a baby, before the canalicular phase of lung growth is done, that baby would be unable to oxygenate their own blood via the lungs at this point if they were outside in the world, right? So combine that with the fact that when you have a rupture of amniotic fluid, again, from the data that I saw, oftentimes an overwhelming majority of the time, you've got 48 hours maximum from amniotic sac rupture before you have the onset of fetal death and fetal demise, right? So when you combine the fact that she had an amniotic rupture early on in the week, right? Early on in the week, and a couple of days have passed. Remember, 48 hours until fetal demise in the case of amniotic rupture, if properly severe enough. So you combine the amniotic rupture with the fact that baby's lungs were not fully developed, along with other organs, but again, respiratory therapist and focusing on the pulmonary system here. Combine both of those things, and it really does not sound like this baby was probably viable, right? Again, this too is important, right? So keep that in mind, right? Medically speaking, it does not seem that this baby is viable, and considering the considerings, you're probably expecting fetal demise to set in here soon, naturally anyway. Again, keep that in mind. Now, how did the police get involved in any of this, right? Well, I'll tell you. Because when she, obviously when she went to the hospital, nurses would have come in, would have asked her, okay, what brings you into the ER today? What's going on? And what I have here is a statement from the nurse that was obtained via news reporters. And I found this quote corroborated on multiple different news sites, again, using the ground news aggregation algorithm. So this is a statement from the nurse in question. She said, this is her statement on the phone. She said, I had a mother who had a delivery at home and came in without the baby, and she says the baby's in her backyard in a bucket. I need to have someone go find this baby or direct me on what I need to do, end quote, right? So based on what the nurse said, it definitely sounds like definitely sounds like the way that Miss Watts told the story, perhaps combined with the way that the nurse interpreted the story, right? The nurse very clearly interpreted Watts' story as there's a fully grown term baby in a bucket in a backyard somewhere. Someone's got to go get this baby, right? She did not take this to mean miscarriage, it sounds like. And so, authorities were contacted, which is what any one of you would do if, you've got them, if you're talking to, your friend or whatever, and your lady friend says, yeah, she had a baby this morning and it's in a bucket in her backyard. And if she doesn't clarify and tell you that this is a miscarriage, yeah, I think your moral code would kick in enough to say, yo, someone's got to go find this baby. There's a baby in a bucket in a backyard somewhere. I gotta figure out what to do in this situation. Right? And so the police, they do what they do, and they discover, the corpse of the baby, or the partial corpse anyway of the baby in the backyard. Um, because I guess I should mention this. I didn't mention this. When she had the miscarriage initially in the toilet, she managed to fish what she could out of the toilet and put it in a bucket and take it to the backyard. But there were still bits that she attempted to flush, and that ended up getting one of the pipes blocked. That too will end up being relevant. But what ends up happening is they end up charging her with abuse of a corpse. Right. So again, we're coming up against another misrepresentation, another misunderstanding about the Brittany Watts case. Right. She was never charged for having a miscarriage. Right. She was not charged for a natural function of the human body. She was charged for what she did after, for what she allegedly did after the natural human body function, the abuse of the corpse. Right. So again, you just got to get your facts straight, right? Because if you're only listening to the pro-abortion side on this particular issue, they would have you believe, a lot of them would have you believing that, she's being charged for having a miscarriage, and this is the problem with pro-life legislation. I'll tell you the problem with pro-life legislation in the second half of this episode, but it is not the fact that pro-life legislation makes targets out of ladies that are having a miscarriage. No, this has to do with abuse of a corpse, which is a totally separate issue, right? According to the Ohio law codes, section 2927.01 on abuse of a corpse, it reads, no person, except as authorized by law, shall treat a human corpse in a way that A, the person knows would outrage reasonable family sensibilities, and or B, that would enrage reasonable community sensibilities. Violating A is a second degree misdemeanor. Violating B is a fifth degree felony, but both are abuse of a corpse under Ohio state law. And since pretty much every news article that I looked at said that she was being charged with felony, and only one of these violations counts as a felony, that pretty much tells me that, okay, they're coming at her from B, outraging reasonable community sensibilities. Right? So, the question that we have to ask here is, upon hearing the facts, would you say that this woman is guilty of breaking none, one, or both sections of the corpse abuse violation statutes here? Me personally, this is just me personally, right? So now that we got the facts on the table, now I can kind of discuss my opinions on the matter. And you're free to discuss. You're free to think about your own opinions too. Now that the facts are actually out, right? Me personally, I don't like either one of these things, right? A says, would outrage reasonable family sensibilities. All right, both of these definitions are somewhat cultural. I think we can, or quite a bit cultural. I think we can all agree on that. But Under A, right, I don't think it's unreasonable. I don't think that you would say it's the unreasonable family that flushes a miscarriage, right? I don't even like the idea, Meredith and I wanted to, we wanted to bury ours, but I mean, she didn't notice that there were bits in there until after the swirling had started. So, just with everything that goes into that, I don't think you can really ding her on A, which leaves B, outraging reasonable community sensibilities. That to me feels even more vague than the first one because communities are made up of a bunch of different people with a bunch of differing ideas on, you know, how exactly a person goes about handling this. So I'm not sure that you can make an abusive corpse statute based upon reasonable family sensibilities or based upon reasonable community sensibilities. I mean, certainly there are some things that you might find universal agreement on, right? Like I think we'd all agree that necrophilia, right, sexual acts done to a corpse, probably fit both of these definitions. But unless you're doing something wild like that, I don't know how you pin anything else a bit more. I don't see how you pin anything that's a bit more pedestrian down with definitions like this, right? And the coroner that did the autopsy on the baby, right? The coroner did the autopsy. He found that there was no evidence of injury to the fetus prior to the miscarriage delivery. So there's no evidence that she aborted her baby. There's no evidence that she abused the body of the little one after the little one was out. And you know with the amniotic rupture a few days prior, you're expecting this sort of thing to come along. So I don't see this as I personally don't see this as abuse of a corpse. I don't see this as outraging reasonable family sensibilities. I don't see it as outraging reasonable community sensibilities, unless you're just going to say that having um, the partial pieces of a miscarriage in a bucket in your own private backyard is outraging to reasonable community sensibilities. I feel like that's the easier case to make, but I don't think that it is an objectively easy case, period. Right? So, as far as I am concerned, right? As far as I am concerned, I don't think that this woman was guilty of breaking any of the sections of corpse violation. And I'm not a lawyer, right? I don't claim to be. I claim to be a respiratory therapist. I claim to be an EMT. I claim to be someone that knows God's word. I don't claim to be a lawyer. But based upon the research that I did, I would be pretty shocked if she faced any time for this. And I definitely think that they gotta rewrite, they gotta reword that on corpse abuse because that to me feels way too vague to be of any real judiciary use. But there's another wrinkle to this story. No, not really to this story. I think we've kind of mined the story for what it's got. Um, like I said, the wisdom of God tells you, hey, don't be so quick to rush to an opinion on a story before examining it. But our culture is definitely using stories like her story and stories like hers to prop up arguments for abortion. And so in the next half of this episode, it is abortion that I want to tackle along with some other things. I've got a pretty long thing that I want to read out here that I think is going to be really useful, really convicting to a lot of us. So for now, enjoy the intermission, and we will be right back with the show. Now, you might be surprised to learn that this podcast is actually not in any way sponsored or connected to the Voice of the Martyrs magazine. As much as I plug them, I plug resources that I believe to be good and helpful. I don't really need a monetary kickback to do that. And so In the spirit of that, I want to announce Friday, March 8th, 2024 at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. Mark your calendars. Like I said, Friday, March 8th, 2024 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The Voice of the Martyrs is hosting a virtual event called I Am In, right? 10 years ago, the self-proclaimed Islamic State, otherwise known as ISIS, began marking Christian homes and churches with the Arabic letter N as its fighters overran parts of Iraq. The symbol N for Nazarene, marked the buildings as belonging to Christians and served as a threat to all believers in the area. Hundreds of thousands of Christians fled the country, but where are those Christians today? And what about those who stayed behind? Right? You'll want to hear about this. I Am In is a virtual event that will include updates on Iraq and first-hand stories from 3 Christians who faced intense persecution in places dominated by Islam. You'll learn how God sustained and encouraged them through their suffering and how he is still using them today to help advance his kingdom. Join Voice of the Martyrs and everyone else that's going to be looking at this like me for those inspiring testimonies of costly faith and enjoy worship music from Stephen Curtis Chapman. And these are the 3 that are going to be there, I take it. Heather Mercer. In 2001, Heather and others on her ministry team were captured by the Taliban for sharing the gospel in Afghanistan. After being tried for a capital crime, they were miraculously released through prayer and help from the U.S. military. 2. Hassan Abdurrahim, I think. In December 2015, Pastor Hassan was arrested on national security charges for providing aid to a persecuted Christian. Though he was sentenced to 12 years in prison in Sudan, he received a presidential pardon and was freed from prison in 2017. And 3rd, John Samara. Born in Damascus, Syria, John leads a team that proclaims the gospel in unreached areas of the Middle East and North Africa. He and his team also help build up and equip local, often persecuted Christian communities. If you're interested, like I said, Friday, March 8th, 2024 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, you can register your family, your friends, your church, whatever, for free at IamInEvent.com. That is IamInEvent.com. All right. I'm just reading off the flyer here. They'll get you set up with a downloadable host guide, customizable promo materials, streaming access to the end of May, which this podcast will be using and abusing for sure, and a free book offer for everyone who attends. I Am In virtual event. All right. I am with the Nazarene for sure. Friday, March 8th, 2024 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Be there or be square. And now back to the show. All right. Welcome back to the show. And I got to say, friends, implications abound. Implications abound. Because, as I said in the previous part, it's very difficult to think of her story without having culture kind of force feed the usual abortion rhetoric into your face and down your throat at the same time, even though I would argue that the story of Brittany Watts, or probably most women that are going through something like this, which isn't many, but I would imagine that it's just got nothing to do with abortion. This seems to be like Brittany Watts' story is tragedy compounded by tragedy, it seems, based upon what I would consider to be too vague of a wording about what constitutes corpse abuse. But I don't see how abortion has anything to do with that. Right? Pro-choice people, pro-abortion people will want to connect a case like hers to the, to the repealing of Roe v. Wade. And in all honesty, guys, considering the facts that were laid out on the table, how can you, being intellectually honest, believe that somehow Roe v. Wade still being on the books would have prevented this woman's particular snafu from occurring, right? Like, how would that have happened, right? And for people to say, well, she would have just gotten an abortion. Well, she still could have in Ohio at the time in which she had the amniotic rupture, she could have gotten an abortion. She was still within the time to be able to do that, right? So Roe v. Wade just would have, she was coming up on the deadline for that, but Roe v. Wade just would have given more time. But the miscarriage still would have happened exactly when it happened. And, then all the rest of those events would have played out exactly as they played out. So I just don't see how this connects at all. Right? But I'm curious, right? I'm curious. What would you guys say? How would you guys answer the question I left you with at the end of the first half, right? Upon hearing the facts, would you say that this woman, Brittany Watts, is guilty of breaking none, one, or both sections of the corpse abuse violation? Right? And this is where I give you the bait and switch, because in all honesty, I don't care as much about the answer to that as I do about the meditation that I was kind of brought to in thinking, in researching her situation, right? And it's at this point that I would like to just read what I wrote, and then depending on how much time we have left, just kind of maybe discuss a few things in closing. Whatever your answer to that previous question, we can all agree that this situation with Brittany Watts is not typical of abortion situations by the data showed in part 1, right? It's not even typical of preterm pregnancy situations, less than 1%. So why are cases like hers being used to sell all the convenience or malice aforethought premeditated murder abortions? Because that's what they are. They are premeditated murder in most cases. People on the political left have made a poster child of Brittany Watts and other women's stories to justify malice aforethought, premeditated murder for any woman for any reason. Right-wing sources seemed to avoid the story based upon what I saw in ground news. Above 60 news stories that I saw, only 6 of which were covered by right-wing sources. I think to avoid considering the possibility that they were wrong or missed their way by making haste with their feet to enforce their desire without knowledge. Neither pitfall, whether left-wing or right-wing, neither one of those pitfalls is truly walking in love for the least of these, the less than 1%ers out there, right? Certain right-wingers didn't want to look at our story because they didn't want to consider the possibility that they themselves were wrong and made too much haste in passing their legislation, while the people on the left, pro-abortion people, didn't really care to look at the true facts of her situation, but decided to manipulate the facts of her situation to their own advantage in pushing their own political agenda. Neither method is truly loving your neighbor or being about truth. My next question, then, again, it's kind of a meta question here. Why does it seem that more women are being prosecuted for corpse abuse than for malice aforethought premeditated murder of her child? Why? Seems like these cases are the ones that want to dominate the spotlight, but why? Why isn't premeditated murder being treated like what it actually is? In states like Arkansas or my home state, North Carolina, you can get abortion pills by mail online, many times for free. In-person clinics and alternative suppliers are available. Though North Carolina is quote-unquote pro-life, we still sanction abortion up to 12 weeks. up to 12 weeks gestation here in North Carolina. For rape and incest, it's 20 weeks gestation. And fetal abnormalities that are classified as lethal, up to 24 weeks. Full abolition, and this is where I will show my cards here, right? Full abolition is only the start of justice. But we are not even there. Christians, do not be a part of this problem. And why do I say that? Why do I say that? Because I believe that many of us are, right? In my time as an EMT, and this is where I deviate from my written tirade here. When I was an EMT before I graduated as a respiratory therapist, right? But while I was still in school for it, while I was an EMT, I remember running a call to a QT gas station for for a hemorrhage, for a pregnancy / hemorrhage, right? We roll up on the QT, and it's me and another EMT. It's just a basic truck for those that know the lingo. We roll up, and at least the first one's there anyway. We roll up, and young lady, high teens, low 20s maybe, bleeding out in the women's bathroom in the QT, right? Looks crimson, looks scarlet. You know what I'm saying? And we take her blood pressure. She's pretty hypotensive. I think she was like 80 or 90 systolic, something like that. So we radio out for ALS, right? Per protocol in our county, we radio out for ALS. And so paramedics arrive, and I'm riding in the back with them, getting IV started and hooking up other vitals or whatever. And we thought that she'd had a miscarriage because it looked like a miscarriage. You know what I'm saying? That's what it looked like. Get to talking with her some more, and turns out that this was not a miscarriage. Not like Brittany Watts. This was not a spontaneous miscarriage. This was an induced miscarriage. She took abortion pills to poison her child, to cause rejection, right? And now that child was dead, right? But the young woman was not fazed in the slightest. She was on her phone I can't remember if it was FaceTime or Snapchat video chat, but she was, on a video call with somebody through some social media app. They're friends, just chit-chatting, laughing, chuckling, you know what I'm saying? Making jokes about what's happened, right? And we rode in the back with her for 30, 40 minutes on the way to actually the hospital where I work at now as a respiratory therapist, interestingly enough. And, her dad, got in contact with her dad, and, dad didn't have any problems with this. I say no problems at all. I understand, I understand just the relief of seeing that your daughter's okay, but there was no disappointment, there was no sadness, there was no moral outrage at all from either one of them over what was premeditated murder on her part. Calloused. All right? She was not the stereotypical picture of a woman fearful, right? That pro-abortion advocates would have you believe. She was not the stereotypical depiction of a woman who was victimized by the abortion industry. This woman did not seem to be a victim. She very much seemed to be the active participant, the principal agent, right? As many pro-life organizations will say that women are just being victimized by abortion. This woman did not strike me as a victim, but as a calloused perpetrator. And she struck all of us that way. We didn't share that opinion with her because our job is to treat, not to opine on things that disturb us. But after the call was over, after we dropped her off, we were discussing that situation. And keep in mind, um, I hadn't had I hadn't had as much experience then as I have now, but talking with seasoned EMTs and seasoned paramedics that had seen their share of nonsense and ridiculous and tough things in this county, right? Talking to paramedics that I know have carried the corpses of dead babies that they did CPR on into the ER. And to hear everyone say that relatively simple hemorrhage call, I mean, it wasn't a difficult call, gave her some IV, got some fluid resus going, you know what I'm saying? Like it wasn't difficult. We didn't even have to go lights and sirens to the hospital. She was not easy to stabilize. But the callousness that she showed towards taking an innocent human life, towards taking the life of her child, was so cold it was scary. It was so cold it was scary. And it left all of us practiced, seasoned, with me being the exception, emergency medicine practitioners, right? Left all of us weirded out, left all of us sick to our stomachs, right? Heck, one of those paramedics said that actually was the creepiest thing that she'd ever seen. Why? Because it shouldn't be, right? A mom callously taking a chemical on purpose to kill her unborn child should not be. If there is any place on the planet where you should know you are safe, it is in the arms of your mom. It is in the womb of a mom. It is under the protective umbrella of one or both parents. That is where you should know you are safe. And so the fact that our culture has inverted this natural knowledge is nothing short of satanic, of devilish, right? Full abolition is only the start of justice. But we're not even there. Christians do not be part of this problem. 77% of North Carolinians identify with Christ. 77% of North Carolinians identify as Christian. But I have to say, bull. I do not believe that the abortion mills in this state are surviving off of 23% of the population, right? And based on the numbers I looked at, 20% of the population does not identify with religion, which means that last 3% is made up of every other non-Christian faith combined. Interesting numbers, right? Just as slavery, no way the abortion mills are surviving off of 23% of the population. Just as slavery stayed institutionalized with permission of many local churches of the day, the same holds true for abortion in the state of North Carolina. We, Christians, say one thing with our vote and another with our lives and our sexual ethics. We drop off the cross at a voting booth and don't pick it up again for 4 years. You cannot commit to the social vision of King Jesus if you live in defiance of the spiritual vision, repentance of sin, of lust, murder, fornication, that is sex outside of one man, one woman for life marriage, apathy, and dehumanization. There is forgiveness at the cross. Don't hear me wrong. Jesus paid for it all, but he intends all who are forgiven to daily put to death in them the things that made forgiveness necessary in the first place. Let me say that again. There is forgiveness at the cross, but God intends all who are forgiven to daily put to death in them the things that made forgiveness necessary in the first place. Issues and stories like that of Brittany Watts are a distraction from the issue of abortion. The elephant in the room no one wants to look at is not corpse abuse. It is human abuse. We claim to be about saving lives, but we recoil from criminalizing the act of taking them, right? We claim to be about saving lives, but recoil from criminalizing the act of taking them. Having handled the case of Brittany Watts already in the first part of this podcast, I can hit the elephant named abortion head on. The Foreign Saints podcast is not pro-choice, obviously, but neither can we say anymore that we are pro-life. We are anti-abortion abolitionists. Let me say that again. The Foreign Saints podcast is not pro-choice, but neither can we say anymore that we are pro-life. We are anti-abortion abolitionists. I realize that God mentions establishing justice more than saving lives, because lives are saved by establishing justice. Let me prove that to you. Isaiah chapter 10, verses 1 to 4. Read. We're going to slowly exegete this over the next couple of minutes. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees. Reading from the ESV. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil, and that they may make the fatherless their prey. What will you do on the day of punishment, in the ruin that will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth? Nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain. For all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. All right, starting in verse 1, woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, right? That's like one of the heaviest things God could say to you in the scripture, right? Woe to you. It is not well with you. Why? Because I am against you. I am against those who decree decrees of iniquity. I am against law writers who keep writing oppression into their laws, right? And we might call it incrementalism. We might call it taking one step at a time, but we've been doing that for some time, fam. For 50 years, fam. And in some of these states where we've got quote unquote pro-life majority in the lawmaking seats, we're not abolishing abortion. We're not criminalizing it. Why? Why are we writing oppression into our laws? Why are we turning aside the needy, the neediest of us, from justice? Why are we robbing the poor of their right? Right? I'll tell you why. I will tell you why. What Isaiah says is the reason. 1, that widows may be their spoil, and 2, that they may make the fatherless their prey. Right? That widows may be their spoil, and that the fatherless become their prey. Right? Those babies that are being walked to their death in the womb of their mother. Those babies that are being walked into a modern day Auschwitz in the womb of their mothers, unable to run and completely ignorant of what they're being brought to. Right? Those fatherless become prey because law writers keep writing oppression and keep decreeing inequity. And what does God say? He says, what will you do on the day of punishment? What will you do on that day of punishment? And in this context, he's not talking about final judgment, though it does apply to that. He's talking about earthly judgment. What will you do, O Israel, when that day of punishment is brought to you from afar, from Babylon, from Assyria? What will you do in that day, right? God does judge nations for these things. That he does, right? What's my proof that God judges nations? Well, I mean, I could be flippant and just say the Bible, but to be cute, I would say Leviticus chapter 18, verse 24 on. God says to Israel, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things. If you want to know what these things are, read the earlier bits of chapter 18, right? What God is saying though is that for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. Right? When you read Leviticus 18, you see a bunch of practices that God tells the Israelites not to do. Why? Because the nations around them were doing those things. And so God judged them and vomited them out of the land. And God says, and if you do those same things, I'll kick you out too. I will kick you out too. And one of the things that those nations were doing, right? You can read about it in other parts of the Old Testament. One of the things that those nations were doing that Israel eventually started to do is child sacrifice, right? Child sacrifice for their benefit, right? Murdering their sons and daughters in fire ceremonies for what they believed to be their benefit. Isaiah 10, 1-4 shows us that God is against the writing of laws that turn any of the fatherless into prey. The history of America being slow instead of decisive in ending the peculiar institution of slavery, and our modern slowness in decisively ending the peculiar institution of abortion, prove the wisdom of Ecclesiastes 8:11 is true. Quote, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Let me say that one again too. Ecclesiastes 8:11, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Pro-lifers may say that they'd rather show mercy triumphing over judgment a la James. My counter is twofold. One, it is evil to allow premeditated murder off the hook in the name of Christian mercy, because as 1 John 3:15 tells us, no murderer has eternal life within him. And two, the concept of showing mercy is robbed of all meaning if there is no law to transgress. Mercy is shown to those who have broken actual laws. No court, earthly or heavenly, can show mercy where there is no established law. What we were trained to call mercy by the pro-life side, letting women off the hook for knowingly murdering their children, is the sloppiest, cheapest, most hypocritical form of mercy in our age. Arguing for the holiness and sanctity of life while tossing out the scripture, the only basis of holiness and sanctity we can appeal to, is foolishness. Until those that engage the culture are willing to embrace being like the prophets, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, willing to allow the thus says the Lord of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and Zephaniah and Ezekiel, Amos, and all the rest echo through you in the modern day, we have no true message. And we are not foreign nor saintly enough in our evangelism. All right? I feel very strongly about this. It's been a meditation that's been burning the midnight oil within me for some time now. Right? Slavery was only abolished. Slavery was only dealt with when it was criminalized. Like, you get that, right? Like, there was no... all of the incrementalism in slavery were simply efforts to keep it around. That's all it was. That's all it was. When they wrote into the Declaration of Independence or into the Constitution that slavery would be abolished 20 years from the Constitution's publishing, they weren't really committed to it. Because let me ask you something, right? If you, individual Christian or listener, know an alcoholic or a drug addict that says, yes, I'll get clean in 20 years, right? You know they're not really serious. And likewise, if you roll up on a baby murderer that says, I'll clean it up later, you're not really serious. right? Because evil can be done in increments. Good, especially good of the soul, just has to be done, right? Just has to be done. You can sin in increments, but good is usually practiced wholesale, or as wholesale as you can get, right? And I just gotta say, my theme for a lot of these topical episodes this year is skeletons out of closets, and abortion is one of those, man. Abortion is one of those. Abortion by pill is actually like the way to get abortions now. Like the scalpel is becoming obsolete, right? Why would I drive out of state? Why would I drive to a clinic when I can just order a pill online, right? I mean, how quiet is that? How easy is that? How easy is that, right? I don't have to involve anybody. I don't have to, make a mess at my, I don't have to make a mess amongst my local church. You know what I mean? Like I can just make life easy. And when we write our laws in our pro-life states that aren't just abolition, what are we doing? What are we doing? Right? Is Jesus satisfied with managing sin? Or does he say in the Sermon on the Mount, those that hunger for righteousness will be satisfied? Right? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, he tells us what his standard is. Woe to those who write iniquitous decrees and make the fatherless their prey. All right, we got to stop making the fatherless prey. We have to stop excusing murder. Stop excusing murder, right? You want the mercy of God to mean something towards murder, it's got to be criminalized, fam. It's got to be. Or else what are you telling people? That, oh, I don't like abortion, but you can do it with no consequences? Who do you expect to change, right? Who do you expect to change? And I get it. This is very unpopular. This might be the most foreign thing that I have ever stated on this podcast. And it took me time to work to this conclusion, but it's biblical. And if we're committed to the spiritual and social vision of Jesus Christ, then I have to let the Bible say what the Bible says. And I got to say, this is where I stand, right? If pro-choice people slander me, okay. If pro-life people slander me, okay. If Christians slander me, that hurts the most, but okay. But I follow the king. We follow the king on this podcast, right? So just consider what has been said today. Right? Consider what has been said, consider what you've heard, and ask yourself, what is scripture really saying? What is the will of God on this issue? And then live accordingly. Right? Until next time, y'all. Peace.